Have you given any thought to contributing to the melt? It's easy to do. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and for as little as $3 a month, you can get access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. It helps to keep the magic happening here at the Melt. So I encourage you to karmically entangle yourself with the Melt today by subscribing monthly for less than the price of a container of goatee wax, or a prosthetic pinky, or a half stick of DMT butter, or an inflatable casket, or the shrunken head of an Atlantean supermodel, or a woolly mammoth's merkin, or a crystalline replica of Baba Yaga's hut, or a capsule of Sasquatch dander.
This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
If one looks at nature as a complete and perfect system, then it's not hard to imagine that this realm, as long as one does not stray too far from its natural rhythms and works in collaboration with it, contains all that anyone needs to heal any malady that comes from natural causes. A realm that is holographic, in which all of its pieces contain the whole, would certainly operate this way. It's only when we veer away from nature that the balance is offset and problems occur. Whether it be by diet, environment, or mindset, when we act outside of the natural order, we become discordant and begin broadcasting that frequency, which could then make others around us or our environment off-kilter. But there are ways to restore the balance. Traditional Chinese medicine is a good example, as it works with every body as its own ecosystem. No one gets lumped together under broad, ambiguous categories where they are then treated just the same as everyone else that has been categorized with whatever diagnosis. And at that, it's their symptoms that are being dealt with, not the root cause of what their imbalance is. Spagyria is another example that I've just recently found out about, and I'm compelled to look into it further. So it seemed only natural to talk with someone who practices it. Today's guest, Phoenix Aurelius, an alchemist, researcher, and educator, joins us today to talk about all of the above and more. I start off the conversation by asking Phoenix to explain what spagyrics is.
Yeah, so spagyrics, let me define this two ways. When people use the term spagyrics in the modern era, what they're typically referring to is basically herbal tinctures that have potassium carbonate added back to the product, and then that's what they would refer to as spagyrics. So like oftentimes we'll get requests like, hey, do you have a spagyric of, lady's mantle, American ginseng, blood orange, whatever. That's not technically the correct usage, but that's the way that it's used most modernly. Spagyria itself and all spagyric medicine has its roots in a pharmacopoeia that was created by a guy named Paracelsus in the 1500s. And basically, Spagyria comes from two ancient Greek words. Paracelsus named it himself. He was very good at inventing words and terms. And he invented the term Spagyria, which comes from two ancient Greek root words. The first is spao, which means to separate. And then the last is called agiros, which means to recombine. So yeah, spao and agiros, to separate and to recombine. And technically, what you're doing is not just separating any old things. What you're doing is separating what we call three philosophic essentials, or what is called in Latin the tria prima. And what the tria prima are the first three things that emanate, that are present in all things, which are the soul, the spirit, and the body of those things. And so that's the first step of any spagyric preparation, is to separate out the soul, the spirit, and the body of the material. And then the second step of that is to really be able to perfect each of those in their own right, getting rid of all of the dross or all of the excess, everything that is not absolutely necessary or medicinal in the case of making medicines. And then the last phase is to recombine. And so what we do is we take these purified essentials, or the tria prima, the sulfur, mercury, and salt, and we recombine them together in order to make various items of pharmacopoeia. And this is just as relevant to the vegetable kingdom as it is to waterworks, as it is to the mineral kingdom, metallic kingdom, and animal kingdom as well. And so Spagyria actually is an entire corpus of medicine with its own methods of diagnostics and its own methods of prescription that are able to address a wide array, in fact, every type of disease, condition, illness that you can think of. And Paracelsus, in his own time, was way ahead of the curve by being able to create this form of medicine. And in his day, he was treating things like syphilis and the plague and leprosy and mental diseases and what we would consider today to be psychiatric disorders and different types of things like that, plus everything else that you could possibly think of, from the common cold all the way on up. And so, cancers, tumors, etc. So it's very, very intact. So just a quick recap: spagyrics in the modern day typically just reduced to very simple herbal tinctures with potassium carbonate added back. They're very effective, but at the same point, the entire scope of Spagyria is far more broad than that.
And the process of making these into tinctures, the plant essences, is it really is just a matter of making them more potent, right? Like taking a lot and making it into a little in order to make it a more effective treatment, or educate me.
Yeah, I would say yes and no. It can definitely be more potent, but not in all cases. Basically, the idea is that the spirit of an herb, we even use this term. If you go to the liquor store or go out to buy alcohol today, you'll probably see a section that says distilled spirits. And the reason for that is that it's considered that the spirit of the vegetable kingdom is ethanol, or at least that's the volatile spirit of the vegetable kingdom. And we would take that material, and then we would extract a plant, and all of the color that you see when you extract a plant with ethanol dissolving into the ethanol is what we refer to as the soul. So if there's any volatile oils or essential oil content in that plant, like there is, say, in lavender and rosemary and lemon peel in very copious quantities, then that will get absorbed into the alcohol. And then anything that colors the alcohol is considered to be a fixed sulfur, or we would also refer to those things as like glycosides, glucosides, alkaloids, the quote-unquote active constituents of a plant that largely color it. So there's those two different types of sol, or what we would call sulfur, volatile sulfur, and fixed sulfur, that come through in the plant kingdom. Then we calcine and leach and purify all of the ashes to such a point where they're 99.8 or higher percent potassium carbonate. And then we recombine those potassium salts back into the tincture, which ends up creating new plant esters. And the process chemically is known as esterification. And so not only are you, quote unquote, potentizing, to draw this back to your initial question, what we're doing technically is creating new chemical plant esters and biosynthesizing something that came completely endogenously, just completely from the plant itself, but exalting its virtue and making it not just more potent or more efficacious, but literally creating it into something that is new that you wouldn't find just in the plant itself, no matter how much of it you consumed. Gotcha. And so that's really kind of the basis of it, I suppose.
Okay.
Now, is there a plant that you work with that the soul and the spirit and the body are more willing? If you understand what I'm saying, like they're more available.
Yes and no. Every plant can be extracted to some degree through these methods, but there are certain things that don't have a whole lot of alcohol solubility to them. Lily bulb would be a great thing to bring up right now. Many mushrooms, most of the polysaccharides are not very ethanol soluble, but they are water soluble. There are, trying to think of a couple of other examples, some root vegetables, especially like wild yam, for instance. It doesn't really have a whole lot of alcohol soluble fixed sulfur. A lot of the medicine is very water soluble. And so there are entirely other items of pharmacopoeia that we are able to make within spagyric pharmacopoeia that exalt those virtues, but they use slightly different processes. We're still working with the tria prima, or the sulfur, mercury, and salt, but we're doing it in a different way. So it's important to understand that water is a mercury. In fact, that's called a universal solvent, or a universal mercury, throughout all three of the kingdoms, vegetable, animal / mineral, metal. So we can do that. We can also make fixed vegetable spirit, which is going to be acetic acid, basically, or vinegar would be acetic acid in its most diluted form. So we can use different types of things like this, and we can also extract just with water alone. There are plenty of items of pharmacopoeia that just use water alone to be able to extract the sulfur component. So on that level, that's definitely something. Some herbs give you plenty of stuff, both water soluble and alcohol soluble, and vinegar soluble or acetic acid soluble. And those, a good example of that would be, like, for instance, rosemary. That offers a tremendous amount of both types of sulfur, both volatile and fixed. Volatile sulfur would be essential oil content, or volatile oils. And so we would take water initially, and either through a hydrodistillation or a steam distillation, be able to pass steam and heat and water through the molecules of the plant and be able to pull up and rise with that steam the oil content. And that's really cool and unique, because oils, always float on water, even on a microscopic level. And so we're able to do that, and that extracts really well through that method. And so plants that yield a good amount of essential oil typically tend to lend themselves better to items of pharmacopoeia that we would refer to as philosophic essences, for instance, and also philosophic tinctures. That's basically where there's a high concentration of essential oil inside of the product itself. A couple of examples of that would be like lavender bud, clove bud, rosemary, lemon peel, just about any of the citrus peels, actually, and just about all plants that you would find that yield a large amount of essential oil. And so those lend themselves very well to those processes. Spagyric tinctures, pretty much any plant except for the ones that I first mentioned, like wild yam and lily bulb and certain mushrooms and stuff, lend themselves to those items of pharmacopoeia, or to the spagyric tinctures. And then there are other items of pharmacopoeia, like for instance, primum ens, or ens tinctures, that are best produced with herbs that have a lot of scent but don't have a lot of essential oil. So rose petals come to mind. Lemon balm comes to mind, things like that. So they're very, odoriferous. They have a lot of scent to them, but it's not the essential oil content that is causing them to be like that. And that item of pharmacopoeia lends itself best to those herbs. So every different herb kind of has one, sometimes more, but at least one method of extraction that is ideally suited based on its kind of constitution and what it contains.
Here's a question that I have. You use the term philosophical, and I heard you bring it up in other interviews that we listened to, and it's not in the usual sort of context. What does it mean in a spagyric context? Because usually you think that, philosophy, that's sort of a science of the mind and problem solving and looking at the world and stuff like that. So how is it used in this context?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So before the advent of the scientific revolution, every alchemist was considered to be a philosopher. Philosophy, in its actual, the roots of its words, we have Greek phil or philos, which means lover, and sophia, which means wisdom or knowledge. So it's a lover of wisdom or a lover of knowledge. And so a person who is a philosopher pre-scientific revolution, which has obviously carried over in the alchemical tradition, is an individual who understands physics, which would be not just what we deem to be physics today, but it would be an understanding of nature and her laws and her rules. Included in that is going to be the sciences of astronomy and geometry and what we would consider to be today natural sciences, botany, what we now consider to be chemistry, philosophy itself as we consider it to be today in terms of understanding human nature and the nature of the mind, and just like the how shall we call it, like kind of the mental plane of things, breaking things down into their ideas and philosophizing about them. There isn't one thing that you could point to or talk about that is not technically part of what we consider to be philosophy as a term before the scientific revolution happened. And so sometimes we'll joke around and say that, it's really cute that people are specialists today, but alchemists don't get that leisure. We have to be specialists in everything. And so today there's a term in that, in kind of modern scholasticism and academia, they would call those generalists. And generalists are not specialists, but they understand a wide scope of things, but maybe not as intensely focused as what a specialist might. And that's the way that we look at things. So philosophy is the art and science of understanding everything that exists and everything that can be observed.
Gotcha.
Go ahead. So as you are creating this relationship with the plants that you work with, one thing that I gathered and I really enjoyed about listening to your interviews with Crow is that you were talking about just the entire process and growing these herbs and really kind of seeing each plant from beginning to end. In that process, do you do incantations? Do you pray over the plants? How do you get the most you can? How do you stimulate that relationship with the plant in order to get the most efficacy from it?
Well, that's a really beautiful question. In many ways, your question itself answered some of those aspects. Is that, when you grow things, if the plant is designed for yourself or your family, you would put the seeds into your mouth and actually allow it to mix with, what we would consider now to be your DNA or your energetic essence by way of your saliva, and put them into the ground. That also inoculates them with very healthy and beneficial bacteria and yeasts that are found inside of the oral microbiome as well. And that would be a way that you can connect with the plant a little bit more deeply and get to know it, because it contains part of you from the moment of its very inception into the ground and from that moment of insemination. So there is that definite aspect, but then, tending to it just on a practical level, going in and watering it, watching it as it grows through its different life phases. It's a lot, it's really not that much different than having a pet or even having children, in that the more time that you spend with it and you create with it, the more of a relationship you're going to have with it, and the more of a healthy relationship you'll end up having with those plants and those herbs and things like that, to where they almost become an extension of you. I remember my mom always used to tell me when I would do especially something wrong, she'd be like, "Son, you can't lie to me. I know you better than you know yourself." Well, why? Well, because she saw me through the entire gestation long before I was actually ever born and took my first breath and became my own being. And so with that being said, she does know me better than I know myself, or at least did for many years. And she also knows the aspects of me that came from her. And so you begin to see yourself in the other. And that's part of the quantum aspect of observation. And really what differentiates modern day science from the philosophical pre-scientific approach to observation is that you're always looking for yourself in the other, whatever the other is. And so I think that that's a really important aspect of the work that is oftentimes overseen. And sure, incantations, intentions, prayers, mantras, all of those things can be added, especially if they help you as an individual identify with that material a little bit more by sharing in some sort of aspect. Also within the Western witchcraft tradition, it is oftentimes considered that any plant is able to cure everything if you only know the song to unlock its potency. And so being able to let the plant, and within the Peruvian shamanic tradition, which was kind of my first introduction to this concept, those are called ícaros. And the ícaros are songs that the plant itself teaches you as you diet the plant. So, you take parts of the leaves and make these strong decoctions out of them and drink them while fasting or eating very, very lightly for a number of days or even weeks. And then the plant consciousness is able to express itself through your consciousness. And if you're open to it and ready for it, then that plant will actually teach you a song that will enable its curative properties to be able to be used on other individuals as you apply it to other individuals and also to yourself. And so that's kind of a path of shamanic vegetalista is what we would call it, or vegetalismo. And that practice is not unique to just Peruvian shamanism or Mesoamerican shamanism, but very much so an idea that was very pervasive throughout the entire world at one point, and definitely still persists within European witchcraft traditions as well, European-based witchcraft tradition.
It's interesting because what it reminds me of is the Buddhist tenet or the Buddhist philosophy not to cook when you're angry.
Yeah.
And not to eat a meal with someone that you're angry with, and what I've always kind of gleaned from that is that the energy that someone is putting into the food you are actually ingesting.
Absolutely.
So it seems like another form of that whatever your intent, wherever your mind is when you're actually tending the plant, will inform how that plant responds to you.
Absolutely, yeah. From a quantum scalar perspective, energy transference is happening 100% of the time. We're transferring energy right now, even though we're separated from a distance, because we're enabled not only through this digital astral interface, but also through the mental plane, sharing ideas. And so our mental bodies, and to some degree, even our emotional bodies, spiritual bodies, are maintaining this energy transference where you're making an effect on me and I'm making an effect on you. And this is part of how evolution happens with everything. The stars are constantly making energy transference to materials in nature. So, astronomical timing is important, especially for somebody who wants to be able to harness the powers of the stars inside of the plants. And the energy transference of emotional resonance, spiritual resonance, causal resonance, mental resonance, physical resonance, all of these things are all principles that you are able to affect the multidimensional anatomy of everything and anything that you interact with, simply by being aware of interacting on it or interacting with it on that level.
That's so fascinating. I remember a story of the Chilean miners, and they had 30 minutes of oxygen in the mine that they were trapped in. And there was one person in the mine that had a watch, and he was the timekeeper telling people how long they had basically to live. And he was lying to them and saying that they had a lot longer time. And the only person who perished in that was the man with the watch, because he actually knew what the time was, where the other miners perceived time to be affected in a different reality. So in some sense, it feels like it's a placebo effect because we're influencing our reality. So in some sense, any plant, as you're saying, could have healing properties if we have that relationship, if we have that understanding that we are that plant, we are already connected with that plant.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've seen some really fascinating things during my time in Peru. I went to this little town called Lamas, which is in the high Andean jungle. So it's definitely on the Amazon side of the Andes, but it's in the higher areas, kind of where coca and cacao and things like this grow.
Mm-hmm.
And I visited a tabaquero, and a tabaquero basically is a plant healer or an energy healer who uses tobacco. And they will take this mapacho, or this Nicotiana rustica. It's like the oldest variety that we know of tobacco leaves, and grows in the jungle. And they'll take an enormous amount of it and load a pipe about that deep and about that wide, just completely full of this tobacco, and smoke on it till they get that energy into their system and get into a trance. And then they'll blow the smoke over the individual and do what the plant kind of directs them to do. And I've seen cancers healed this way. I've talked to people who had, enormous tumors removed, who were able to have, huge gaping sores healed. And then other more subtle things, diseases that we now classify as, say, viral or bacterial in nature. Those things were able to be healed through nothing other than the use of this smoke being blown over them, and so the energy transference of the plant itself and of the shaman and his or her intention. And so, like I've seen this happen to other individuals, and I've also experienced it myself as a healer and energy worker many, many times over the years. And so, it's just one of those things. What they all told us many years ago in school is like, oh, it's mind over matter. You're cold because you think you're cold. You're hot because you think you're hot. You're, whatever the case is. That is more true than anything else, because the mind has potency over reality, quote unquote, because reality is entirely subjective. And so if you create a different reality for yourself consciously and keep working at it, and it's just like a muscle, the best magicians know this. You can take an incantation or, a quote unquote spell and just run through the motions and get absolutely no effect out of it.
Sure.
But the more that you practice it, the more that you're able to feel it, the more that you feel it, the more that you're able to sense that something energetic is happening. And the more that you practice, the more you realize that reality separates in a certain regard and allows your intention at the forefront of the causal plane, which then allows all of reality to restructure around that causal amplitude or that causal reality that you are intending, and it restructures the way that it works. And you can make many miraculous changes in quote unquote reality, just by using that science. Principles of mentalism would be another term for those who are not familiar with the magical tradition or have some sort of sense of resistance to it.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I find so interesting about allopathic medicine, because I think the danger is that people consider doctors an authority. And so the relationship immediately goes into this place where someone else has control and power over your healing. And I think that's where Spagyrics is so fascinating and alchemy is so fascinating, because what alchemy is saying and what Spagyrics is saying is that you are the architect of your physical body, and you are creating a relationship with the plant, and the plant may be the vehicle, but you are really the driver of that. And so it takes the onus into the person that's being healed. So what your position then becomes is that you are just, and this sounds so woo-woo, but you're creating space for people, and you're giving them something and saying, this is something that can have an influence on you, but you are the determiner of the influence.
Exactly. In fact, inside of spagyric medicine, Paracelsus wrote pretty extensively on the concept of what he identified. The English translation would be something like the inner healer. And the idea is that every inner healer already knows exactly what is out of balance and exactly how to put it back into balance. Most people don't take the time to connect in with their inner healer, instead opting for, like you were saying with the allopathic model, other individuals to take accountability of their own health for them. And in my experience, from where I stand now, that is a very irresponsible attitude to have, because everything that the self needs is contained within the self. You are a microcosm of the macrocosm. You have every aspect of nature already abundantly available in you. Every metal, every mineral, every animal, every plant is already inside of you through billions of years of evolution in terms of your DNA and your constitution and just literally the mineral, like you eat plants all the time. You're constantly eating carrots. You contain the medicinal potency of carrot within you. You're constantly engaging with animals and looking at animals. The second that you see it, it registers in the brain, in the mental plane. You have that animal, you have that thing, you have these minerals, some of which are physically a part of you, and some of which are a part of you in more subtle dimensions, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, etc. And so there is not one thing that anybody lacks at all. It's just the acknowledgement that they don't lack those things. And if, like a harmonic resonance, like through tuning forks, if the healer is able to help that individual realize and recognize that thing that they have forgotten about within themselves, then we're able to bring that thing back into harmonic resonance with the entirety of that microcosm of that individual and stimulate some form of healing.
It's fascinating how people have become their diagnosis.
Yeah.
And it really becomes a mantle that they carry, and energetically, it just seems like a laziness. Like, oh, well, I have this and that's why I'm this way, as opposed to saying, these are the things, this is part of the gamut of my human experience, but not laying claim to one and standing on that rock.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I like about traditional Chinese medicine, is it doesn't have the usual list of maladies that you suffer from. You're more like, your bladder is hot and the heat is rising and it's making your sinuses react. Blah, blah. So you can't really identify with that. You can't grapple with that in the same way that you could, that you will see on any medical drama on TV and see how it manifests and stuff like that. So I like that. And it's very tailored to the individual, which it seems Spagyrics operates that way too. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And part of this is linguistic. If I were to go back to many of the Romance-based languages, and even though, English is both Germanic and Romantic in its structure and history, we do definitely take on a certain aspect of the Romance languages in terms of identification with disease. And you literally use the verb to have in order to identify with a particular malady. So I have cancer, for instance. I have, this viral disease. I have, whatever it is, somebody has it. And that causes them to, because there's no verb or technique that has been exposed that is widely circulated for a person to suddenly release that thing.
Right.
That's not a common term. Is like, if somebody says, "Oh, how are you feeling?" and you say, "Oh, I released my disease." That would be such a weird phrase to hear somebody say.
Yeah.
But in languages, especially Goidelic languages like Irish, for instance, you would say, especially with emotions or disease, you would say, for instance, "Sadness is upon me." So it literally is this different way of thinking that if something is on you, obviously you can get it off of you.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's just a different way of identifying. And our language largely sets us up, because many people aren't aware of how to think in thoughts. They only think in words. And that's a very low vibration of consciousness. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I understand that probably 99% of the people listening to this podcast might think in words, but I want to open up the possibility and the field of possibility that you can think in thoughts at the speed of thought, which dwarfs the speed of light infinitesimally. And that is something that is just so important to realize, because if you can free yourself of language and just use language as a tool, now it opens the mind up to vast possibilities, because it is not restricted through communication. It is open to, its language becomes ideas, which are infinitesimal and do not really know any sort of barrier or common colloquial phrases.
Yeah, it's like saying I suffer from ...
Right.
So that becomes an incantation. You're telling your body that your body is suffering, and the body will take that signal and adopt whatever information that you're giving it. It's so interesting to see how the verbal world has such an influence on plants, on animals, on tissue.
Yeah.
So how do you navigate that when you're dealing with someone? And I know we don't use the word patient in your sphere,
Sure.
but when you're dealing with someone, how do you work with that language when you see that the person that you're speaking to is using these negative incantations?
Well, the first thing is lack of acknowledgement. I do this when a lot of people will say anything to me, and I learned this from a good friend of mine named Sean Allen. It's a psychic technique that you just use to reflect back to the person what they're doing. And if they'll tell you, oh, yeah, like I am suffering from, blah, blah, blah. Cool. And it's like, wait, cool. That's not a response. Usually people literally end up giving a person their emotional energy via pity or sorrow, or, they'll even say things like, I'm sorry. That's silly to me, because why are you emotionally invested in the suffering of this individual and literally transferring your emotional currency to them in order to perpetuate that narrative or that story? It doesn't make sense. So if I can just stand back and be a mirror and place my awareness about right here and just be completely emotionally detached, yet compassionate to what they're actually going through simultaneously that would cause them to say that, now I can develop a deeper awareness of that thing and help them develop a deeper awareness by not buying into that story. And we have to realize that we're constantly weaving tales of our reality through the words. Words are geometric. Many people take a look at the science of cymatics these days, where we take various tonal frequencies, sounds, and we see solid materials like sand or water or other things beginning to form in that way, but yet they don't realize that we're 70% water and our words are tones. They are vibrations. And even when you just think about them written, there is a certain sacred geometry to every single letter that are composed of circles, that are composed of crescents, that are composed of straight lines and angles. All of those are all geometric in nature. And so what we're really dealing with is the exact same science, just two different forms, tonal, non-tonal, which is to say, basically like subsonic, sonic. It's not that different than the things that we already realize. We're just not noticing or putting the pieces together. And so it's very important for me as a healer to not buy into the stories that people have about their own experience, especially when they say, oh yeah, I'm skeptical because I've tried everything. It's like, well, you haven't tried this, so why would you be skeptical about it?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, even beyond that, there are just aspects of identification that would do me nor my clients any good to be able to identify with their story, but rather to compassionately understand intrinsically where they're coming from, to say, here are the symptoms that I find myself dealing with that cause me this type of emotional resonance. And so I'm constantly deconstructing the sulfur, mercury, and salt of what people are saying, listening to it, trying to perfect it and get rid of any of the excess, and putting it back together just the same that I would with any material that I work with in my laboratory. And I think that that's really the mark of a true alchemist at a certain point, is that alchemy isn't just an instant. It's not just a profession. It's not something that you do just temporarily and then walk away from it. It's a way of life. It's a way of living, a way of seeing, viewing, and interacting with reality, to be able to exalt and transmute things, even on the most subtle or minute aspects of our existence.
Are there certain parts of the body that correspond with certain emotions?
Well, I mean, yes and no. Like, for instance, if I ask you, remember a time that you felt grief, where did you feel that grief?
It
What would
feels
your
like
answer be?
a punch to my chest.
There you
My
go.
body immediately reacts, like in the heart center.
Perfect. And if I say, remember a time that you felt confused, where do you feel that confusion?
Cerebral, it's brain.
Perfect. And if I said, remember a time that you don't feel confident or that you feel uncertain, where do you feel that?
Shoulders.
So you have your answer.
Man, I'm good at this.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody is an expert in that. They just don't think of it in these simple terms.
Sure. Well, what came first, spagyrics or alchemy? Is spagyrics sort of an offshoot of alchemy, or did they transpire separately? And I have no idea about the history of that.
That's really cool. That's a great question. So alchemy has been around at least since ancient Egypt. That's where the term alchem in Arabic literally means from chem, which we think scholastically probably was referring to Egypt as the Black Lands. Not necessarily because of the color of people's skin or anything like that, but there are all sorts of different philosophies of why they would have called it the Black Lands. But that's basically where the term comes from. And so alchemy was practiced long before Spagyria was invented. And alchemy was not always used either in the same ways that it was practiced in the Western laboratory alchemical tradition of the late medieval and early Renaissance period leading up to the scientific revolution. In fact, it was used very much so as a spiritual science to perfect the priests and prepare the priests and also pharaohs to be able to assume incarnations as the stars. That is the ideal manifestation of all souls on this planet, to be able to transcend and leave. So in Buddhism, we oftentimes talk about the concept of nirvana, which is, we call that a blowing out, but that means that you release your karma from this world and you become kind of like this cosmic entity. It's the same exact concept throughout every tradition. We have it in the Druid tradition, authentic Irish Druidry. We also have it, in the Egyptian tradition as well. And the idea is to be able to live a life where you can epitomize the story of the gods that are made manifest inside of the stars, and then to be able to assume and to move into those stars through your life, through your deeds, through your work, and through the rituals of how you live. That type of tradition is still most commonly practiced through Dzogchen Buddhism today. And the idea is that not everybody is ready to be able to attain that cosmic consciousness. And that's not because some people are higher or lower than others, but that there is an ascending scale and a descending scale to consciousness and reality, where some beings are deliberately coming from cosmic reality back into physical density. And then there are some people moving from physical density to cosmic reality. And there are all manner through those scales of people in between. And so the goal of a pharaoh or a king or queen or royalty, just in general throughout many, many ages, was that that is the pinnacle of what you are able to attain in this physical dimension over other individuals. You are provided with everything that you need. You are able to control the fates and destinies of others. And at that point, you have the ability to be able to ascend back to a more cosmic consciousness. And whether or not that's true, that's the way that a lot of various individuals and cultures conceived of this idea in ancient times. And that presumably comes to us from Sumerian and Assyrian type priestly attitudes. So with that being said, that was kind of the purpose of alchemy during the Egyptian realm, was to be able to make substances that would show how nature and reality are actually fluid, so that we can understand more about the science of the soul and how to be able to perform the separation of soul, spirit, and body, and get the soul and the spirit to be able to conjoin and to move into a new body at the moment of death, or shortly thereafter, within about the first 3 days after death. And so it was a very spiritual science at that time. And then, the Greeks took over Egypt, and they were like, oh, wow, a lot of this is really cool. They can actually tinge baser metals into gold. Let's use this for ornamentation and for industry and for our palaces and temples and different types of things like that, because mining gold and refining gold itself is very hard, laborious, tedious, and very expensive. And so if we could do it with things that are easier to mine, then that gives the illusion that these things are awesome. And because they've been alchemically transformed, to them, there really wasn't a difference between actual gold and this alchemically created gold-looking type substance. And there were also spiritual aspects with it, but it took on very much so a kind of industrial feel during the Greeks. Then the Arabs ended up taking over after the Greeks. Well, I guess the Romans, and then the Arabs. And when the Arabs took it, they took it into an entirely different perspective that started to apply it to multitudinous different things. In fact, a lot of the literature is very, very, especially from modern day Iran, from Baghdad. You'd see these Persian alchemists who were able to imbue kind of like steampunk-like devices, birds and things that were slightly mechanical with souls and spirits, which they would refer to as jinn. D-J-I-N-N would be how we would spell that in English.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
They would take these jinn and be able to infuse that consciousness into things and be able to imbue life and understand multiple different aspects of alchemy. But then they also started using medicine as well, alchemy as medicine. And so by the time that the Moors of Morocco ended up taking over parts of Spain and therefore introducing alchemy of the Moorish or of the Arabic world into Europe, and then spreading out from there into the European field, medicine had become at least a part of the study of alchemy. And all of the predecessors of Greek and Egyptian forms of alchemy also never fully died. They just took on new incarnations through this. And so we have the ideas of transmuting baser metals into gold, which was very, very popular throughout, maybe even infamous throughout most of Western Europe. And then we also have medicine that started to pop up primarily, actually, as a result of Paracelsus. Now, other people like Albertus Magnus, who came before Paracelsus, and a few others, they were still practicing medicine and practicing alchemy and learned in those skills. But it was really Paracelsus who told the entire alchemical community at large, stop practicing alchemy for the pursuit of riches, because that is temporary and does nothing good for your soul or for your spirit, but rather use the knowledge that you have to be able to make and exalt the nature and the virtues of nature to heal your fellow man and to be able to heal yourself, because by so doing, you are able to exalt the soul and able to fortify the spirit and be a much better and more useful human being. Instead of something that's entirely self-serving, you are now giving back to your community and providing healthy and beneficial service that tends to be a whole lot less karmic in nature. And also at his time, he ran into the very same medical problems that we have. If you read any of his texts, the main problems were that even if he wanted to prescribe medicines to people in order to heal them, the pharmacies didn't have those types of medicines. They had ones that were commercially available and viable, which were oftentimes of a lesser quality. The physicians oftentimes never even saw the patient, or if they did, for a very short period of time. Usually they would even have runners, which we would now equate to like nurses, to be able to run all of their tests and relate the information back to them, and then to have the runners go back and perform all of the things except for, whatever surgeries needed to be done, which surgeries were not really smiled upon in Paracelsus's age. Some minor surgeries were, especially for battle and things, but organ transplants and things like that were not. It was a Christian taboo. Like you don't cut into a cadaver or cut into a body. And so there were all of these different aspects. And so it was Paracelsus who came up with the concept of Spagyria. And he was born in 1492 and died in 1541 or so. And so we really didn't have Spagyria as a thing until about the late 1520s, early 1530s as an idea. And so alchemy definitely came first. And alchemy earned itself a very poor reputation in Western Europe because so many people were talking about having the secrets to transmuting gold, and they were lying, of course, many of them. Many of them probably did, but it's just like that old adage, those who say don't know, those who know don't say.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So is it possible that nature, and I know this might seem like kind of an obvious question, that nature came before Spagyria, and that these plants were being utilized all over the world before Paracelsus, but it just wasn't being given that specific name?
Well, yes and no. So it was the Arabic philosopher Al-Jabir who came up with the concept of the sulfur-mercury theory. It wasn't until Paracelsus where Paracelsus said, you guys are dealing with this third philosophic essential, but you never give it a name. It's nameless, and that's called salt. And so it was considered that sulfur and mercury were kind of polar opposites, but Paracelsus revolutionized it and said, no, sulfur is very masculine in nature. Salt is extremely feminine in nature. Those are the opposites. And in fact, when you take sulfurs and salts inside of the laboratory, which would be, say, like essential oils, they have a high concentration usually of various acids inside of them, and salts are bases. And when you combine those, they actually create chemical reactions of acid-base reactions. And so those are very polar. Mercury doesn't do much of that. It doesn't react to salt, and it doesn't react, but it rather contains sulfur. And so it is androgynous, or sometimes referred to as hermaphroditic. And this is why the term Hermes or Mercury is actually referred to the entire principle, because it fits that same archetype, that it is part of the above and part of the below, but neither. It's a messenger of the gods to humans and from humans to the gods, so to speak. And it can relate to both, but it doesn't necessarily react with either. And so there's that entire aspect. So with Paracelsus, these plants were definitely being used, but they were not being used in the same way. He created very unique items of pharmacopoeia that, if they were being performed like this at any point throughout history, we have no record of it before Paracelsus. He literally ingeniously created thousands and thousands and thousands of different items of pharmacopoeia and multiple different ways of processing these plants from an alchemical or spagyric perspective to be able to create healing in the very particular ways. Like, for instance, ENS, E-N-S, plural being entia. It means like the source of origin of a thing before it's physical. So an ENS tincture captures that particular essence of that thing just in the mental or causal plane before it actually precipitates into anything physical or even astral at that point. There are also astral forms of medicine where we're able to capture the form of, to borrow a term from Carl Sagan, the star stuff of a material, and be able to imbue that. into the medicine itself and to be able to give that. Or the archaeus of something is the aspect that is halfway between the mental plane, basically, or what we would refer to as the astral plane, and physical reality, which we would now more commonly call the etheric structure of something. And so he was able to utilize alchemical processes to be able to capture these very subtle energetic aspects of the plants, to be able to bring back into harmonic resonance of the individual or patient that they were applied to, this aspect of them that was out of balance, that was at the origin of their particular disease.
So why do you think that these plants spoke to him in the way that they did, and he was able to manifest spagyrics, and no one else was doing this? Do you think that some of that had to do with his personal history and growing up with his father, and kind of seeing the form of medicine that was being used and the lack of success in that medicine?
Absolutely. And suffering creates a depth of personality that nothing else can.
For sure.
His mother died at a very early age, and he was born a bastard. His mother was the innkeep at this tiny little inn in Einsiedeln, Switzerland. And he loved his mother dearly, but she was sick and died, possibly even through malpractice by his father. Inadvertently, of course, but died. And then he saw nothing but people, because his father was the only physician in this tiny little mountain pass town. He saw nothing but disease and ailments and people suffering and dying from a very young age. And it's theorized, we don't know this for a fact, but it's theorized and very highly likely that he was eunuchized by his father to prevent impregnation of any of the guests or the damsels who would come and stay at the retreat. And so he lost a lot of sexual drive. And if he wasn't eunuchized, he had no sexual drive, and very oftentimes scolded people for being tempted towards sexuality just in general. He didn't have very great things to say about people who allowed their animal instincts to overcome their higher intellect or greater nature. And so his suffering was so great. And by the time he was like 14 or 15, he enrolled in the Swiss Guard and was taken basically wherever the Pope wanted them to go. And as part of the Holy Holy Roman Empire of Germany. And that he was on the battlefield and saw, again, nothing but death and wounds and disease. And by being surrounded with that, you almost have to be a sociopath to not want to end human suffering, not only for yourself, but also for the others that are constantly within your scope of awareness. And so sure. I think that this is probably, if I put myself in his shoes, having read, hundreds of biographical accounts and all of his literature, I think that this is really at the core. He was also, so compassionate. He oftentimes scolded the doctors of his age for never being at the bedside of the sick. And he said, how could you possibly hope that anybody could heal if you're not at their bedside with them, going through what they're going through and understanding it intrinsically? That gives you all the wind underneath your wings that you need to be able to find the remedy and the inspiration for it to put that suffering at an end. And so that's my answer, I guess.
Now, just very quickly, did he travel a lot and then have experiences with plants from other regions where he was traveling?
Yeah. As far as I know, we don't have a whole lot of firsthand accounts of all of the places that he traveled. It is suggested that he traveled actually as far east as India, though. That being said, we do know that he made it, well past Turkey into the east and was into what we would consider to be Arab territories today. And it's not like you see on movies. When wars happened, there were codes of conduct. And the code of conduct was, if you get slashed or hurt, you sit down and you don't fight the rest of the battle. The reason being that you couldn't afford to lose all of the fighting men in any given civilization. It's just not realistic. But if you fight a battle with codes of conduct and honor, and people follow these codes of conduct and honor, there will be a clear victor, and you may have a lot of hurt and wounded individuals, but the number of casualties will be minimized as best as possible. So it's not all blood and gore like we see in the movies today. And it's also not like you see in the movies, because the healers of either side were not there to just heal their own troops. That was maybe principally important for sure, because you want to minimize as many casualties as you can on your own side. But you would often heal anybody or give water to anybody on the battlefield who needed it, who was fallen and ill, and try and sew them up and heal them. And in the Arab world, the concept of ablution was very important, just washing the hands and freeing the hands of obvious, sediment contaminants. And Paracelsus noticed, by virtue of being in proximity to them, that alone held a huge advantage over just working with bloody hands or transferring from one person's innards to another person's innards without any sort of ablution. And he also got to see many different types of cures. And even during non-battle times during his travels, he would oftentimes take it upon himself, whenever he had free leave, to wander into the villages and find out what the folk and local healers were doing. And he was very certain not to maintain any sort of prejudice towards what they were doing, but to let the merits of the action speak for itself. So if it was highly effective, then he would say, how are you doing that? And try and understand it as best as possible, and then be able to replicate it. So he adopted many different ideas. Like, for instance, one of his most favored herbs was Socotra dragon's blood that comes from the Isle of Socotra, Turkish rhubarb that comes from modern day Turkey. Lots of these foreign different medicines that came from the Far East and the Middle East, and that usually had very high, in Europe, very high monetary values to them. But he would use them in very cool and ingenious ways to be able to maximize the small amount that he was able to possess to be able to go a very long way. And, it's presumable that he learned about most of the different types of herbs from his journeys with the military in particular, because when he comes back from the war, he starts talking to some people, and he gets some sponsors, and University of Basel had picked him up and said, wow, this guy knows more. They gave him professor emeritus status. And he quickly ruined that for himself, because he took all of the books, the modern medical books of the day, and on the very first day of class, burned them and said, I'll take your Avicenna and your Galen, and I will reverberate them to a feces, and I'll take your phlebotomy tables and your astronomy charts, and I'll, cast them into the Sea of Pilatus. And, he just completely goes off on the fact that he actually was quoted as saying, I contain more knowledge in my single pinky finger than you will ever contain in all of your medical practitioners combined. Wow. So, he was a little, to use a term that was actually probably derived from one of his names, he was a little bombastic about what he knew, but he wasn't wrong. He wasn't wrong. He just, he was like that because he hit so much adversity to people being open to his ideas, because there's such kind of like a theology, almost like an indoctrination, an inculcation, if you will, of the medical ideas and the quote unquote proper ways that the church largely condoned of being able to do things. And he did not conform to that, because he saw methods far outside of Christendom's approved methods working far better.
I've always been a little unclear as to what the actual role of an alchemist in a community was. Obviously, a spagyricist, I don't know if that's the proper terminology, would be more of a healer. I've always pictured alchemists as being more sort of like these esoteric scientists that were constantly experimenting with material matter, trying to transform it, transmute it, sort of like more as hobbyists in some basement somewhere without having any great, day-to-day role in the given community that they were surrounded by. Is that the case, or were they engaged with, people enlisting them for whatever reason, for whatever task?
That's highly subjective. It depends upon the time period that you look at things, and it also depends very largely on the individual themselves.
Okay.
That being said, the idea that you just shared with me is probably the most common within Western Europe, at least until after the time of Paracelsus. Commonly they would hobnob with principalities of different sorts, dukes, duchesses, barons, baronesses, princes, kings, things like that, and try to get them to sponsor their work. Now, part of that is that right now we live in one of the coolest times ever, where just a simple, low-born, middle-class person can self-fund virtually all of their own alchemical work through the miracles of industry, which is both a blessing and a curse, really. But still, through the miracles of industry, we've been able to make it so that we can buy glassware now. Glass was unfathomably expensive, and much of the work was actually taken place in copper vessels, which, again, to hand hammer huge copper vessels for the distillation of fluids and things, enormous expenses that
Sure.
most peasants or even, kind of middle class individuals, the equivalent of that in Europe, would never have been able to afford. And so in order to be able to perform the works that they wanted to do, they had to have patronage of some kind.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes that was the role. They would oftentimes be put up in a position, in a place of high status, and if not directly in a castle or a palace, definitely in a place of their choosing somewhere near the castle or palace, where messengers and runners of the king or queen or prince or whomever their patrons were would be able to come and check in on them, see their progress, report back, and things like that. And a lot of these guys really abused their privilege. They wanted to be able to perform alchemy, which I probably would have been one of those guys too. But then they ended up performing very nefarious type deeds and being misleading in order to sustain the patronage as far as possible, and then disappear in the middle of the night when the 11th hour was upon them to actually produce results. And then they would just move to a new area and take up a new identity and do the same type of thing and live their lives kind of as, for lack of a better term, an alchemical outlaw.
Mm.
And so you're not wrong in your assumption there.
Okay.
But after the time of Paracelsus, people started to realize by the merits of his work, they cast him into a leper colony, for Christ's sake. And they literally were like, hey, listen, if you can make it out, if you think you're so clever, you live here, and if you can make it out alive when all these people are healed, then we'll believe you. Well, he did. And all but 2 people who were already too far gone actually exited from the community as healed and no longer having leprosy. And their jaws dropped, but they still didn't accept him, as they told him that they would. And, instead, the traditional Western European Christian thing to do at that time, accused him of consorting with the devil.
Right.
Which he, very bombastically again said, no, I did not. But if God didn't have the cure and the devil did, you better damn well believe that I would have worked with the devil, which didn't help his case much. But it was one of those things. So about 50 to 100 years after his death, all of his students, which were, relatively numerous, went around kind of spreading the good news, spreading the gospel of Paracelsus, so to speak. And a lot of people got onto that bandwagon. And even though he was Catholic, he was very, very reformed. In fact, if he couldn't see a parallel between the written scriptures and his alchemical work, and also see it reflected somewhere else in nature, then to him it was not an absolute truth, and it had no place in his cosmology. So there were a lot of things that were Vatican decrees and catechism of the Catholic Church that he just simply outright denied. And many people of his time actually they would kind of compare him to Martin Luther, and he got so bent out of shape and miffed about that, he would oftentimes say, let Martin Luther account for Martin Luther and allow me to account for myself.
And that seems like as good a place as any to end the first free hour. To access the second hour, really, in this case, the second hour and a half, go to patreon.com/themeltpodcast, where for as little as $3 a month, you can have access to full episodes, early episodes, and exclusive episodes. And those are the products of the monthly Melt meetups that we have, which you also have access to if you subscribe via Patreon. And they are very fun and very therapeutic, and it does the soul good to talk to other open-minded people, which seem to be in very short supply these days. So it's a hot commodity for sure. And another way to support the Melt, if you don't want to do a monthly subscription sort of situation, you can go to our merch store. The link will be in the episode notes. And you can just, in one fell swoop, donate something and get something in return. Not donate, I shouldn't say. There are set prices for different items. You pay that, we get a part of that, and you get some cool Melt merchandise. So there's that. In the second hour and a half, we cover the 5 root causes of disease, ancestral residue, spagyrics and psychedelics, vaccines, adrenochrome, and Phoenix provides a coupon code for all Patreon subscribers for his online store, and he also conducts classes and apprenticeships and stuff like that. So highly suggest checking out his website. Thank you all so very, very much for listening. It is greatly appreciated. And as always, we have very exciting stuff headed your way. Hopefully you think the same thing, and hopefully you glean something positive off of this episode. All right. Take care, people. Until next time. If you've liked what you've heard and would like to contribute to the Melt, there are a few ways that you can do that. The most tangible would be financially. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and there you will find ways that you can contribute for as little as $3 a month. This will give you access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. Contributing financially will also help make the Melt better, pay the bills, and help to make this podcast a full-time endeavor that I can fully devote my time to and provide you with more content. Another way of contributing would be to go to wherever it is that you subscribe to the Melt and give it a favorable review or rating, and this will help it to reach more people. You can also spread the word to friends and family via social media, email, or word of mouth. And lastly, if none of those options are readily available or appealing to you, simply send your positive thoughts and intentions. In an interconnected and quantumly entangled multiverse, these also go a long way. Thank you.